On a summer evening in 1906, high above the streets of New York, a young millionaire walked across a crowded rooftop theater and shot a famous architect in the face. Hundreds of the city's elite watched him do it. There was no mystery and no chase. The killer simply handed over his weapon and smiled. What makes this story a chilling one, and not only a tragedy, is this: he did not run because he knew his vast fortune could buy the one thing money was never meant to purchase. It would become the most expensive defense in American history. To understand the sheer arrogance of the crime, one must first look at the world in which it happened. New York City in the summer of 1906 was a metropolis defined by a staggering, almost grotesque display of wealth. It was the height of the Gilded Age. Industrial titans built towering palaces of marble, while the immigrant working class, the very hands that laid the stone, suffocated in the crowded, disease-ridden tenements of the Lower East Side. The city was a machine designed to funnel absolute power into the pockets of a select few, creating an untouchable aristocracy of steel and coal. In this world, the law was not a shield for the vulnerable. It was merely a commodity bought and sold by men with fortunes so vast they defied human comprehension. At the absolute pinnacle of this glittering society stood Stanford White. He was not merely a citizen of New York. He was the visionary architect who had largely designed its opulent aesthetic. A man of immense appetite and towering influence, White drew the blueprints for the city's most exclusive landmarks. He was heavily connected. He moved effortlessly through the drawing rooms of the elite and the shadowy circles of underground gentlemen's clubs. Yet, for all his undeniable brilliance, he was a deeply flawed man who utilized his immense prestige to cultivate a private life of reckless indulgence. His crowning architectural achievement was the majestic Madison Square Garden. He was completely unaware that the very building he designed from the ground up would soon serve as the theater for his violent demise. On the opposite side of this impending tragedy was Harry Kendall Thaw. He was a man who had built nothing but inherited everything. As the sole heir to a staggering Pennsylvania coal and railroad fortune, Thaw was born into a reality where the word no simply did not exist. He possessed a notoriously volatile temper, a deep-seated paranoia, and an immense, suffocating sense of entitlement. Throughout his youth, he had left a quiet trail of violent outbursts and cruel indiscretions. Yet, he had never once faced a single legal consequence. Whenever his sadistic tendencies threatened to spill into the public eye, his family's financial machinery would quietly move in. They paid off victims. They silenced the police. They erased his transgressions entirely from the official record. This lifetime of absolute impunity cultivated a dangerous delusion. It convinced the young heir that he existed entirely above the moral and legal constraints that bound ordinary men. Thaw had always believed his wealth made him a god. On a hot summer night, he decided to prove it. The evening of June 25, 1906, wrapped New York City in an oppressive, unyielding heat. Seeking relief from the stifling air of the streets below, the city's elite gathered at the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden for the premiere of a musical comedy titled Mam'zelle Champagne. It was a scene of curated perfection. Waiters moved silently among the tables, pouring chilled wine for women in fine silk and men in evening dress. Up there, beneath the open night sky and surrounded by the glow of electric lights, the crowd was entirely insulated from the grime and suffering of the working-class neighborhoods just a few miles away. They were there to be entertained, completely oblivious to the fact that they were about to witness a historic slaughter. Stanford White sat alone at a table near the stage, a towering figure entirely at ease within the magnificent structure his own mind had conceived. He watched the performers, perhaps reflecting on his undisputed reign over the city's high society. Not far away, Harry Kendall Thaw was incapable of sitting still. Despite the sweltering summer temperature, the young millionaire was wrapped in a heavy, dark overcoat, pacing the aisles with an erratic, nervous energy. He walked back and forth, his eyes fixed with a venomous intensity on the architect's broad back. Thaw was waiting for the perfect, public moment to execute a sentence he had decided upon, long before he ever climbed the stairs to the roof. As the chorus on stage began a lively, upbeat number, Thaw finally made his move. He stepped deliberately through the maze of tables, closing the distance until he was standing directly over White's shoulder. There was no argument, no exchange of heated words, and no warning. Thaw drew a handgun from his heavy coat, leveled it at the architect's head, and fired 3 precise, deafening shots. The gunfire tore through the light operatic music, shattering the curated illusion of the evening in a fraction of a second. The bullet struck White point blank in the face and shoulder, extinguishing the life of the city's most famous creator before he even had the chance to register the face of his executioner. For a brief, suspended moment, the wealthy audience simply stared, assuming the sudden violence was a dramatic addition to the theatrical performance. Then, the grim reality of the blood pooling on the pristine floor set in. Stanford White's massive frame slumped forward, his arm catching the tablecloth and dragging a cascade of crystal glasses and silver to the ground as he fell dead. Pandemonium erupted across the rooftop. The elite crowd, stripped of their usual composure, descended into sheer animal panic. Men shoved each other toward the exits, overturning chairs and trampling one another, while women fainted or screamed in absolute terror, their fine clothes stained with spilled wine and the soot of the panicked rush. In the center of this absolute chaos, the only calm figure was the murderer himself. Harry Thaw did not drop the weapon, and he made no attempt to flee the scene he had just bathed in blood. Instead, he stood tall over the ruined body of the architect, holding the smoking pistol high in the air for everyone to see. He broke the cylinder open, letting the empty shells clatter to the floor, and looked out at the terrified witnesses. With a steady, chilling pride, he declared loudly that he had ruined his own life, but he had finally saved his wife's honor. He surrendered quietly to the police officers, who eventually rushed the roof, acting more like a gentleman concluding a business transaction than a man who had just committed a brutal, premeditated assassination. In any normal case, in any ordinary neighborhood, this would be an open and shut murder trial resulting in a swift hanging. But the Thaw family was not normal, and they were about to prove to the entire country exactly what their money could buy. Almost immediately after the heavy iron doors of the Tombs prison closed behind Harry Thaw, the immense machinery of his family's wealth ground into motion. The matriarch of the dynasty, Mary Copley Thaw, descended upon New York City with a singular, unyielding purpose. She was determined to save her son from the electric chair. More importantly, she possessed the absolute, limitless resources required to do so. In an era when a common laborer might toil an entire year to earn a few $100s, Mary Thaw opened a legal war chest of an estimated $1 million. To comprehend the sheer gravity of that sum, one must translate it to the modern day, where it would stand as a staggering $34 million dedicated entirely to dismantling the justice system. With this boundless capital flowing into the city, the defense did not merely hire an attorney. They assembled an unprecedented syndicate of legal power, pulling together a formidable team of the most expensive and ruthless lawyers the nation had to offer. Their overarching strategy was as audacious as their sprawling payroll, because hundreds of the city's socialites had witnessed the killing under the bright lights of the rooftop theater. denying the physical act of the murder was impossible. Instead, this elite legal team chose to justify the bloodshed. They began meticulously constructing a grand narrative in which Harry Thaw was not a cold-blooded, entitled assassin. They painted him as a tragic, chivalrous defender of traditional morality who had been driven to extreme, unavoidable measures by a predatory architect. This elaborate defense, however, required the strict cooperation of the people who had been on the Madison Square Garden roof that night. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the Thaw fortune quietly seeped into the cracks of the police investigation, leaving a dark trail of sudden amnesia and altered memories in its wake. Waiters and attendants who had seen Thaw pacing aggressively suddenly recalled him acting quite calmly. Wealthy witnesses who had clearly heard his cold declaration over the bleeding body found their testimonies softening. Truth was bent under the weight of subtle social intimidation and lucrative, unspoken agreements. The raw, violent reality of the murder was slowly sanded down, reshaped by immense financial influence, until it fit the precise parameters the defense team required to set their client free. Yet, the brilliant men managing this million-dollar defense understood the intricate mechanics of American justice better than anyone. They knew that a courtroom was a fragile theater, constantly subject to the shifting whims of public outrage. The lawyers knew that winning in the courtroom wasn't enough to save a millionaire from the gallows. They had to win in the streets. And for that, they needed to buy the newspapers. The defense team understood that a jury is ultimately drawn from the public. And in the early 20th century, the public mind was shaped entirely by the sensationalist printing presses of Park Row. This was the golden age of yellow journalism, a time when truth was entirely secondary to the visceral impact of a scandalous headline. The Thaw family fortune quietly but forcefully steered this massive, hungry media apparatus. Almost overnight, the narrative in the daily papers shifted. The columns ceased talking about a brutal, unprovoked assassination in a public theater, and instead launched a systematic, ruthless smear campaign against the deceased. Stanford White, unable to speak from his grave to defend himself, was stripped of his architectural legacy and posthumously painted as a depraved monster who preyed upon the innocent. To complete this grand illusion, the press needed a hero to contrast the newly minted villain. The tabloids, undoubtedly encouraged by the defense's deep pockets and carefully placed influence, began twisting Harry Kendall Thaw into a figure of noble chivalry. He was no longer presented as the erratic, violently entitled heir who had shot an unarmed man in cold blood. Instead, the pages portrayed him as a valiant knight protecting the tarnished honor of his young wife, the famous former model, Evelyn Nesbit. Every lurid detail of White's past indiscretions was magnified in bold ink, carefully calculated to make Thaw's act of calculated murder look like a righteous crusade for moral justice. The true tragedy of this campaign was how utterly successful it proved to be among the very people who had the least in common with the killer. The working-class readers, the laborers and tenement dwellers who rode the crowded streetcars to exhausting jobs, devoured the daily papers. Manipulated by the carefully constructed headlines, they began to express a deep, misplaced sympathy for the millionaire. The profound irony was entirely lost on the general public. A man whose immense, inherited wealth insulated him from every ordinary hardship of human life had somehow convinced the impoverished masses that he was their champion, a tragic victim of circumstance who had merely defended his home. Through the sheer force of capital, the press had successfully turned the victim into the villain. Now, the defense just needed a medical excuse to set the killer free. To circumvent the electric chair, the million-dollar defense required more than just favorable newspaper headlines. They needed a medical loophole, and in the Gilded Age, such things could easily be purchased for the right price. The legal team brought forward a parade of highly compensated psychiatrists, men of esteemed scientific reputations who were remarkably willing to bend their medical ethics to fit the precise dimensions of the Thaw family's bank account. These alienists, as experts of the mind were known at the time, sat comfortably in the witness box and utilized complex medical terminology to disguise what was essentially a purchased alibi. They delivered expert testimonies that perfectly aligned with the manufactured narrative of a noble, deeply disturbed husband. The blatant corruption of scientific inquiry was performed entirely in the open, under oath, and heavily subsidized by Pennsylvania coal money. The defense faced a highly specific legal challenge. If they proved Harry Kendall Thaw was permanently insane, he would be locked in a harsh state asylum for the rest of his natural life, stripped of his luxurious freedoms. They needed a very particular type of madness, one that existed only in the exact moment the gun was fired, and vanished completely the second the architect hit the floor. To solve this complex problem, the medical experts simply invented a psychological condition entirely out of thin air. They named this unprecedented affliction Dementia Americana. This completely fabricated syndrome was described to the judge as a unique form of temporary insanity that supposedly afflicted only men of pure American blood when they believed the virtue of their wives had been compromised. It was presented to the court not as a desperate legal fiction, but as a legitimate, devastating medical reality that absolved the killer of all personal responsibility. The sheer absurdity of this diagnosis was staggering to anyone who dared to look past the immense wealth of the defendant. It was a highly specialized, remarkably convenient form of mental illness. It was an insanity that mysteriously never seemed to strike the impoverished laborers of the Lower East Side, nor the desperate men toiling in the city's factories. When a poor man shot a rival in a fit of jealous rage, the justice system recognized him only as a common murderer and swiftly marched him to the gallows. Yet, when a millionaire heir committed the exact same violent act in a crowded rooftop theater, he was suddenly suffering from an aristocratic affliction of the mind. Dementia Americana was an illness whose only true symptom was the possession of unimaginable wealth. It was a medical diagnosis that could only be contracted by the absolute elite. The courtroom had been successfully transformed into a grand stage, a place where bought science and bought journalism worked in perfect harmony to shield a privileged killer from the consequences of his own actions. Every obstacle had been systematically removed by the sheer force of capital. With the press on their side and a fictional disease on the record, the fate of Harry Thaw rested in the hands of the jury. Despite the monumental sum of money poured into the defense, the blatant reality of the murder initially caused a deadlock. The first jury, perhaps retaining a shred of resistance against the overwhelming tide of the Thaw fortune, could not reach a unanimous decision. However, the family simply doubled their efforts, returning for a second trial with even more aggressive tactics. This time, the meticulously engineered strategy yielded the desired result. Harry Kendall Thaw, a man who had publicly executed an unarmed architect in front of hundreds of people, was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was spared the electric chair and instead ordered to be confined to the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. To the public, it appeared that some measure of justice had been served. The killer was, after all, locked away from society. The reality of his confinement, however, was a grotesque parody of the penal system. For the ordinary, impoverished inmates of Matawan, the The hospital was a bleak, terrifying warehouse of suffering, marked by overcrowding, brutal treatment, and complete isolation. For Harry Thaw, it was simply a change of address to a slightly less convenient private club. His immense wealth entirely bypassed the heavy iron gates. He did not eat the standard, grueling rations provided by the state. Instead, he used his vast allowance to have gourmet meals catered directly from high-end restaurants in the city, accompanied by daily deliveries of expensive champagne. He secured expansive, private quarters, furnishing them with the comforts of a luxury hotel, and he was permitted to retain personal servants to attend to his every need. His time at Matawan was not a punishment. It was an extended, fully funded vacation from consequence. He entertained a constant stream of high-profile guests, hosted lavish dinners within the asylum walls, and maintained full control over his massive financial empire. The state had technically incarcerated a murderer, but in practice, they had simply built a gilded cage to house a very wealthy, very dangerous man. This luxurious exile continued for several years, a daily insult to the very concept of equal justice under the law. Finally, by 1915, the grand illusion was brought to its inevitable conclusion. With a few more strategic legal maneuvers and the continued application of overwhelming financial pressure, Thaw was declared miraculously cured of the fictional Dementia Americana that had saved his life. The heavy doors of Matawan opened, and he walked out into the world a completely free man with his fortune entirely intact. The system had not failed. It had functioned exactly as it was paid to. The acquittal of Harry Kendall Thaw was not merely the conclusion of a scandalous murder trial. It was the establishment of a grim and enduring precedent. The outcome proved, with terrifying clarity, that the American legal system was not an impenetrable fortress of morality. It was a marketplace. The Thaw family had effectively written the blueprint for the modern, high-priced defense, demonstrating that a defendant with enough capital could simply overwhelm the mechanics of the law. They showed the nation that with a bottomless war chest, one could buy the loyalty of the press, fabricate entirely new scientific realities, and purchase the very concept of innocence. The ultimate tragedy of the trial lies in the stark, unyielding contrast it drew between the classes. In the very same city courts where Thaw's elite lawyers spun their million-dollar fictions, impoverished citizens were being processed and condemned by the thousands. If a desperate laborer from the tenements of the Lower East Side had pulled a trigger on that hot June night, there would have been no highly paid alienists to invent a medical excuse for his rage. There would have been no tabloid campaigns to rebrand him as a chivalrous hero. His trial would have been swift, his sentence absolute, and his drop from the county gallows inevitable. The working poor paid for their crimes with their lives, while the heir to a coal fortune paid for his with a signature on a bank draft. We are often taught to believe in the absolute, incorruptible integrity of the courtroom. They say that justice is blind, that the law treats every man equally. But in the summer of 1906, justice wasn't blind. It was simply busy counting the Thaw family's money.